Hello, everyone. And it is my pleasure today to welcome our speaker, Professor Raya Muttarak. And please allow me to say a few words by way of introduction. And I try to keep it short. Yeah, but yeah, she has a list of accolades. She is from the Department of Statistical Science at the University of Bologna. She is also Director of Population, Environment, and Sustainable Development at the Wittgenstein Center for Demography and Global Human Capital at the University of Vienna. In 2021, she was the Population and Just Societies Program Director at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. And between 2018 and 2020, she was a chair of the Population Environment Research Network of the RUSSP. Her research interests are in population, environment, and sustainable development, focusing on differential vulnerability, adaptive capacity, human capital, human impact on the environment, migration, and forecasting future demographic and socio-economic trajectories. So her talk is entitled Population Dynamics under Global Climate Change. And we've discussed she would speak for 40 minutes, followed by 20 minutes of questions and answers. So without further ado, let us welcome Professor Muttarak. All yours.
Thanks so much. Thank you. So I was trying to make my talk a bit interactive. So I'm going to post or ask you some questions. So let's have some conversation along the way as well. We have practiced sharing the screen just before, so I shouldn't have made a mistake anymore in this. So you are seeing my slide, I guess. I put in the presentation mode. Yeah. So thanks again for inviting me to give this talk. So I'm not very creative on the title, actually. The reason is because this is really precisely the title of the project that I got a grant from the European Research Council, and it has just started, meaning I have no results yet because it has just started on 1st of January this year, pretty much. So it's going to run for 5 years. So I try to, but I think this is a good opportunity for me also to already sort of lay out the plan of what I would like to do, and also actually maybe can inspire you to work around this topic, or maybe even some collaboration. So I think it just kind of exploit this opportunity that you invited me and think of. I think it's an exciting topic to explore. So that's a kind of the idea of this talk. So it's going to be general. So I just warn you that it's not that I present one paper, but it's just the overall issues around the topic of population dynamics under global climate change, and so which I'm going to elaborate what I mean by this. So yes, just trying to, there's no need to emphasize, but just emphasize a bit more that the impact of climate change are already being felt. When I started the research on this topic, let's say about a decade ago, 10 years ago, roughly, I think it was still, when we say we work with climate change, it's actually we're not really working with climate change. We just look at historical climatic data and see how it impacts health and maybe migration, well-being, and so on. But now, I mean, the science, I think, both from the side of social science, but also the natural science has really established the evidence. It's extremely clear right now that many of the extreme events that we are experiencing, they can do some models that can show that it can be attributable to human-made climate change. So it's called attribution science. So it has moved forward quite quickly also on that side. So typically what they do is that, for instance, when a country or place experience heat wave or maybe storm, so the climate scientists, they would run the counterfactual model to see if there were to be no carbon emissions that come from pretty much from fossil fuel combustion, would we observe or not this type of extreme events? And not all the events can be attributed to climate change, but many are. So pretty much we know that I sort of picked the South and Southeast Asian countries. So this the typhoon in the Philippines, which is linked with human-made climate change. Of course, Thailand experienced 2 years ago the worst drought in 40 years, heat wave. So all of these extreme events are likely to be more frequent and more intense. So that's quite established. What about, oh, I can't click. Let's see, why can't I click? What about Singapore? I did a little research on Singapore. So also sort of kind of established projections how the future climate projections in Singapore would look like. So we have already observed the increase in average temperature in Singapore, the changes in rainfall patterns. So this is sort of quite established evidence, let's say, from historical trend, and then projection would be it's going to get warmer. One would have more irregular rainfall patterns, so this sort of extreme. So for prediction of precipitation, it's quite difficult in a sense that one can't really say that it's going to be much drier or maybe more rain, so that's more irregular, but pretty much the extreme, right? So one tend to get like really, you would get the days that it rains really a lot and flash flood happen, and then maybe in the next month or the next cycle may be drought. So that's going to be more of this kind of irregular patterns, and of course sea level rise as well. That is also something to which is more of the slow onset type of process or events, but it's happening. It sounds doom. I mean, sorry about that, but it's just what we are facing right now. So the questions would be, how are these changes? We know that the temperature is going to rise. We know that rainfall pattern would change, sea level rise. So how it's going to affect our lives? So that's sort of the question in particular. Yeah, so this is just to show this is a European country's evidence. So it can probably affect us in many different ways. So this one we were looking at that experience of these extreme events, because if you think of European countries, pretty much at least in the past, we don't hear much apart from the sometimes heat wave or the big flood, that European countries experiencing climate change. But in the last 5 or 10 years also, different part of Europe. So we sort of divide Europe into the subnational. You can see a bit from different colors. Also experience different kind of type of extreme events. And we found actually that it does affect the areas or the sub-region, maybe north of France, south of Italy, and so on, that experience the increase in the irregular temperature. People also express higher concern about climate change. And that also translates into voting for green parties. So there's a sort of clear cause. So we ran a model that captures the causal link between experience of extreme climate events, increase the concern in the region that have experienced such particularly increase in temperature. And then that concern also translates into voting for green party. So that's just one effect that one could see, right? So we could also ask the next question: if concern about climate change has increased, for instance, would it change demographic behavior? Would it have some impact on fertility intention? Would it have some impact on migration decisions? So that's a sort of the type of questions that we could ask also in terms of looking at population dynamic side. So hopefully I can cover this in 40 minutes. I already spent 5 minutes on the introduction. So what I want to cover And obviously you have the slides, so I may not be able to cover everything, but I can skip something also. So I would see how the time goes. But I want to first maybe outline why do we think that climate change may influence population dynamics? So what are the pathways, right? So the mechanisms. So that's one thing that I think it's important to cover. And if it does influence population dynamics, do we have to account for this climate feedback when we do population projection? So I just want to lay out a bit why population projection is also highly relevant thing to do, and why do we do population projections, and yeah, exactly. Do we have to account for the climate feedback on population dynamics? And if we have to, how are we going to do it? So I also want to cover that, and because precisely when we want to know how future population will look like, we would have to unpack, right, how climate change will affect fertility, how climate change will affect mortality and migration. So that's sort of the approach that I want to use would be, let's look first as historical trend. What are the current evidence? And if it does have some relationship, then we can think of how are we going to account for the future climate change when we want to look at future populations. So that's a kind of the whole idea of this talk. Let's try to cover everything. So so first of all, the studies, when people look at the relationship between population and environment, in the beginnings, let's say from the 70s, 80s, it's more common that people are interested in looking at the population impact on the climate. I mean, rightly so. So this kind of quite a famous IPAD. It's called IPAD identity. So I represent the human impact on the environment, which is the function of population. Affluence typically measured by GDP, and then T is technology, which is the impact per unit of consumption. So typically in a kind of simpler type of models, people tend to say that the higher the population and the higher the impact, which it's true, it does have a positive relationship, but pretty much actually the GDP per capita have higher, because we know that countries with higher population size, if you break it down by capita, consumption or emission is not as high as some high income countries like the US or European countries, for instance. So that's kind of interest. So there's a lot of things that demographers can contribute already around this topic, because when we talk about population, the natural scientists tend to just plug in population size, maybe population density max. We try to say that actually there's a lot of heterogeneity there, because of course different income level, different education, age distribution would change completely the level of consumption. So that's already one thing that if someone is interested, the demographer can contribute a lot. So my proposal would be, okay, it's important to look at this population impact on the climate, but since we are already experiencing climate change, so we should maybe look at so we add the terms I after the population, that perhaps when we think about population impact on the climate, we may have to account also for the feedback of climate change on the population itself. So in terms of modeling, I think it's quite complex if we really have to do the modeling, because that means it has to be dynamic, right? Because it has a reciprocal relationship. But ideally, that's what we aim for. I mean, not me, but in general, that what the climate community also aim for, to account for the two sides of the feedback. Now, I want to talk a bit about so why this is the case. So how could climate change affect fertility, mortality, and migration? So climate change induced the sort of two type of events, so the rapid onset events, this type of extreme events such as flood, mudslides, windstorm. So this is what we call it. It's one time off, right? So you have flash flood, and may last for 1 day or something, but it's just a rapid onset type of events. And then climate change also is linked with slow onset events like the rising of the average global temperature, for instance, sea level rise. Of course, it takes time. By the end of the century, if we go on with the current level of emission, it's projected that sea level rise would be 1 meter, which is a lot. Like 1 meter rise is a lot, but we don't see it now. It's a slow onset type of process, and other type of thing like salinization, desertification, loss of biodiversity, and so on. So these events, both the rapid one and the slow one, can have both direct and indirect impact on our life, health and well-being. So direct one, you may think of some things like if the storms, the typhoon Q, right? So it's really direct. So it just go directly. It can cause injury or diseases. It's also actually have a high temperature. It does increase mortality actually, for particularly of respiratory and cardiovascular diseases. So there's a relationship there. So that's kind of direct. Increase in heat wave. So if you experience heat wave, it may for subgroup of population, they are really susceptible to mortality from heat wave. So that's direct impact. Or even you may think things like evacuation or displacement can also be direct if the storms come or you experience the typhoon, you may really need to leave your house. But many of the impact of climate change would be indirect, because climate change not only kills you directly, but also it can affect agriculture production, your livelihoods strategy. If it affects agriculture production, it may affect your income, job loss, even schooling. Actually, it has some evidence also that in extreme hot days, children are not doing well in exam. It does affect cognitive function too, or even heritage and culture. If people have to move or change their lifestyle, livelihood. So these indirect impact may also affect fertility, mortality, and migration. So I would say that actually most of the impact of climate change would be indirectly through these type of channels. So if it does impact our life, we may indeed have to account for those impacts when we want to know how the future population would look like. So there are many ways to do population projection. The UN tend to use the approach of probabilistic population projection. So sort of you can have the wide range based on the statistical models, right? Or you can use the another approach, which what we do in Vienna, is a scenarios based approach. So one could imagine that this is the current population that we observe, and based on different scenarios, such as you may think that there could be a scenarios that every country invests a lot in health, family planning, in education. In that particular scenario, we call this SSP1, or shared socioeconomic pathway, scenario 1, which is the world where every country sort of move in the same direction in terms of the level of development. Then in this case, population may not be as high as other scenarios. So we can also do projection in that way, sort of think of how the countries, particularly in the socio-economic drivers that may drive population, would change in the future, and through that driver, how fertility, mortality, and migration pattern would look like. And it can make a difference in terms of our population size plus composition as well. So I'm not going to go through too much into these scenarios, but just want to highlight that, and the climate people community actually really come back to us quite often because they really want to know. So, okay, you can have scenarios. That's good because they also have their scenarios, and to be able to know what would be the future temperature, what would be the future level of water security, food security, and so on. So they need to know how population would look like. And also they also want to know actually the heterogeneity, such as differences by income level and maybe even population composition, because there's also, so it's actually not the focus of my talk, but there's also people who look at the impact of population aging on emissions, because you may think that actually older people would would have different lifestyle, right? So they travel less, but they might require more energy to heat up their home. And in total, if you have higher number of older population in a country, what would emissions pattern would look like? So that can have an impact as well. Men and women also tend to have different level of consumption. So it's very important to know the future population also in its link with climate change. Yeah, so I think I covered that already, that future composition matter. It's already 20 minutes, so I can skip that. So yeah, I think many of you are demographer. No need to emphasize, if we need to account for the climate feedback on population dynamics, I was saying earlier, then I have to unpack because the three components that would determine population change would be, yes, fertility. I need to know how climate change would affect fertility behavior. Then the same thing, mortality, because that's also another component of population, and of course the migration. For demographer know well that this is the most difficult thing to predict. We do have quite good knowledge, I have to say, if compared with migration, also data on fertility. Mortality also, if you sort of know that certain level of education and the mortality risk, then one could still calculate life expectancy and project into the future. Fertility, also the number of average children per woman by level of education. Once you know that, then you can sort of still think of how fertility would look like in the future. Migration is just the most difficult thing, the most volatile thing, but we also have to account for that if we want to know about the future population dynamics. So three things. So my grant, what I'm trying to do is, first of all, actually we don't know what would be the impact of climate change on these three components, right? Fertility, mortality, and migration. So we just need to find out first. There's some evidence, of course. I'm not claiming that everything is new, but yeah, we just need to know also what direction and to what extent, because to know population projection, we need to sort of capture, because it actually climate change may increase or decrease migration. So we need to capture also that direction, and also to what extent. Maybe it's just minor, maybe it does affect fertility, but maybe not that much. If it's not that much, we don't really have to account think too much about it to account for it when we do population projection, but we just don't know. We just don't have knowledge on this, actually. And I kept on saying the heterogeneity, it's also very important to do it by population subgroups and also geographical regions. So one thing that the field is trying to move forward, it's try to merge a bit with geography. As geographers are very good in going into different locations and knowing the details, but maybe of population distribution, for instance, where people live, but maybe not looking at who live in that place, because who live in a different communities or areas or villages would also determine the level of vulnerability and exposure to climate change. So we also need to account for that. Another thing that we haven't done much is also look at the pathways. Theoretically, one kind of thing that, yeah, I was saying that it's likely to be indirect effect of climate change on demographic behavior. But typically, the typical analysis is we take the climate data, because you can actually look at the changes in the pattern of rainfall, the wind speed. Even nowadays, you can do that, and the temperature, and then look at the outcome. Actually, we don't know. We don't tend to look at actually maybe the change in temperature does affect agriculture use, and then through agriculture use channel, then it affects migration, for instance. It hasn't been done much, and this is something that I think it would be important, because once you know the mechanisms, if you want to think about the policy intervention, then you know where to intervene, right? So we don't need to wait until to see temperature rise. I found the effect with undernutrition for children aged under 5. But if we know that it actually really goes through the food distribution or food security, then the intervention could be around that. You intervene at if you already observe a reduction in agriculture production, then you may think of distribute food or whatever. So I think understanding mechanisms can have some policy relevance as well. Yeah, so that's what the project is trying to do. So it, as I said, it just started this month, and I'm still trying to set it out in Italy. So there's no particular result to show, but what we can discuss. And I know many of you work on fertility and family, and so I would like to maybe ask. You can type in the chat, or just speak up. What do you think that the impact of climate change on fertility would be? I guess in terms of direction, would it increase, or would fertility increase or decline, or no impact at all? Because there's no right and wrong, obviously. We just don't know. You can also type in the chat so I can see, like, increase or decrease. Climate change, yeah, maybe I should say that maybe negative climate change. So what I mean is maybe too hot, too much rain, or maybe too dry, drought. So the negative one, because you can think of that as also positive impact of climate change in certain areas, right? But if people experience negative climatic shocks, do you think fertility will increase? Has someone put something in the chat, because I can't see it well?
Actually,
Sorry, Zoo, is the chat available for?
Maybe not.
No, right?
Yeah.
Is it? I think it's not, right?
Okay, then that's fine. Yeah. If any
Zoo?
idea?
it's available for people typing. No, I think you can always type. I mean,
yeah, it can only type
to Rabia.
Zoo and Rabia.
Yeah.
Okay, then no problem. But if someone want to sort of
okay.
share your idea, if you have things,
Okay. We now can send it directly to you, Raya.
So
Prof. Raya and Prof. Chua, the co-host, so they'll be able to send the questions to them as well.
Okay, I may be able to see something, but I mean, one could also speak as in what if you have some idea. Okay, I think I can see something. So Shuya said negative climate change correlate with low fertility rate. And why? Why would it be negative? You're muted. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks for the good question, and it really encouraged me to think the correlation. I'm thinking maybe the more unstable like people feel, so they are more likely to not having the kids, not having the children, because the climate and everything is keep changing and it's not stable. So I guess it's hard for them to starting the making the family plan, I guess. So that's
it's a bit like in insecurity, yes, because people find the negative I'll explain this with COVID as well. In fact, people link a lot COVID and then climate change. Yeah, I think that's really one possible mechanism. And I also got from someone saying that negative impact as well, because it may influence child's physical health. From Nansun who's saying this, yeah. Which
Sorry, for some reason I can't
yeah.
see the chat. But never
think
mind. It's okay.
It comes directly to me. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
But,
Okay.
So this is more just of trying to think, right? I think there may be some negative climate shock may lead to an increase in fertility. That's one side of thought. So some people say that, for instance, if you think about in the past, investment in children, because children are the sources of labor. So they argue that, say, if you in agricultural household, in farming household, for instance, so if you know that you're going to always experience these irregular patterns, or you need more labor to work in the farms, or yeah, I think that argument is this way. So food production may become something extremely important. So agriculture, farming as an occupation probably very important, because you may even benefit from that, because food scarcity may be an issue. So in this case, you may want to have more children because you can use the labor in the farming or something. So that's a kind of, maybe that's a typical kind of a slightly economist school of thought that say that it may increase fertility. Some demographic work in the past also show that after experiencing some catastrophic natural disasters like earthquake and the Indian Ocean tsunami, they also pick up some trend of fertility replacement, because you sort of replace the child who die with more number of children. So it may lead to the positive increase in fertility, but I do think, and I talk about evidence a bit, that probably the negative consequences on fertility, it's probably have a bit more evidence or more argument on that. So first of all, it can actually affect the physiological effects. So there have already been studies, especially for medical science, that show that hot temperature affects fecundity. So that's almost a direct effect. It does suppress the ability to become pregnant, and maybe it's increased risk of diseases. Then you can also think of the indirect channels, such as the reduction in crop use, and it affect maternal and nutritional status, and again affect the fecundity. For many countries where people don't have direct access to tap water, to running water, so they would have to walk to fetch water, right? And with drier condition, that means people have to walk further. It tend to be women who go to fetch water and collect water in some rural area in Africa or also South Asia. So in this case, it may affect your physical health and ability to get pregnant. So that's a physiological effects. And also we just heard already from Shuya, about the psychological or psychosocial effects. So with instability, insecurity, or concerns about climate change may also suppress the fertility intention, at least the intention, because obviously it tend to be younger people who also express that concern about climate change, and also say that maybe I don't want to have children or have lower number of children because, worry about the ecological crisis. And if you put your children into the world right now, and the child is going to grow into experience all this climate change, so it can suppress intention. But of course, with younger people, you all know well, if you ask someone age 25 about their fertility intention, doesn't mean that at age 35 or 40 they would say the same thing. So we don't know yet. That's something to be captured. And also some people also do express the human impact on the global climate, right? So it can be the I don't want to have children because actually Prince Harry did say that he didn't want more than 2 because the more person you put on in the world and the higher the impact. So some people say that. Now I just check the time because it's almost running out. So yeah, so I was just saying that there's some evidence that pointing towards a sort of the negative one. Already studied in historical study, like in the US and some in Europe also show that with hot temperature, it does suppress the fertility rate. I just want to point out that another study that came out using longitudinal data from Indonesia did show that there's some negative impact, but heterogeneous impact. So it tend to affect a bit more the farming household, for instance. So I want to move quite quickly because I want to talk about mortality as well, and maybe a bit migration if I can still have time. Yeah.
Sorry,
so,
Raya, if I could ask you to wrap up in about 5
Yeah.
minutes so that we can have a Q&A
exactly.
after that.
I think
Thank you.
that makes sense. So
Thanks.
in terms of mortality, I sort of thinking of asking you what do you think the impact of climate change would be on mortality. It can be the hotter the temperature, then it affects your life. It can go in that direction, or it can go in an extreme way, right? So you can have the extreme cold weather and then the extreme hot, and because too cold it's also not good, so it may affect your health and the mortality risk as well. Evidence tend to pick this U shape, but stronger on the hot temperature side. So yeah, and of course it varies across countries, because if you start with the baseline with cold countries would be more sensitive to hot weather because they're used to cold weather. And then another way around for very hot countries, sometimes the too cold, people cannot adapt as well as the hot. So now the question can be, which we don't know much. So there's a lot of kind of epidemiological studies, health studies on this, but it's not consistent, because you may think if people in European countries, there will be more people mortality during the heat in summer. But in the past, people die more from in winter. So in terms of population projection, at the end, throughout the year, it may be the same, because it's just substitute winter excess mortality with summer excess mortality. So maybe we don't have to account for that. So that's something that I want to find out. So I'm gonna leave it here. You can play with this in the slide, because my climate scientist colleague did show actually that it does vary the exposure, because he wants to say that there's an intergenerational inequity, right? So it's a people born today would be much more exposed to heat wave, Wi-Fi's, and so on. So there's under different climate scenarios. If you click the link, you can also play a bit with the scenarios as well. Now on migration, this is actually, I was saying that migration is something that we, as a demographer, it's more difficult to capture, but the studies, there's a lot more studies on climate change impact on migration compared to fertility. Fertility is really a new field. But migration, it always captures the media and the headline. People like to see, migration is a hot topic, right? People also want to predict how many environmental refugees would be and so on. And one can question actually the method. How can you come up with 150 million climate refugees by 2050? So the field has moved a lot around this direction, sort of from the scholars that tend to say that there's going to be a lot of number of millions and millions of refugees, so that particularly social scientists tend to play down a bit and try not to predict this number, but tend to say that environmental change is not a single driver of migration. It may affect agriculture production, it may affect economic condition, maybe even social drivers, and then through that channels, it may affect a migration decision. So that's a kind of the way that social scientists tend to approach this topic of climate-related migration, trying to understand the different factors that affect migration. So not just plug in temperature increase and let's look at how migration pattern would be, but try to understand also all the variables in between. So that's how the field is moving forward. So just to show that different factors we know well, I mean, right? Because age is a key factor actually that influence migration pattern, education, and so on. But there's some relationship also with things like temperature and rainfall. Since I'm wrapping up, it's just more of trying to say there has been an increase in the empirical studies. So these are all quantitative studies that look at climate-related migration. And in the past 10 years, so in the beginning when I started working on this field, it's a big mess because already a mess on migration definition, environmental definition. You can capture climate in many different ways. Migration can be rural to urban, international, different contexts, and so on. So what we did is we did a meta-analysis of the evidence, but not only that. So I think I can kind of relatively in the past 10 years, so up until now, we have a bit better consistent evidence, so I can have a bit more confidence to say that negative climatic conditions may affect migration, so increase migration, but not everywhere. We tend to pick the effect around those middle income countries or middle income or households that are not too poor and not too rich. So that's one quite consistent evidence that come out, because if you're too poor, you don't have enough resources. Migration is costly. You don't have enough resource to move. If you're rich, you can adapt. So it's a sort of the middle income-ish that moved. Agricultural dependent countries or household would be more sensitive. And then, countries that experience conflict. So that's relatively quite consistent evidence that just recently been established. Not much study on internal migration. If you work on migration, you know that it's really actually difficult also to capture the movement, particularly if we want to work on like a lot of different countries, many countries. Some of you may know the IPUMS data. So it's a micro census that we started using it to harmonize the internal migration flow. So that can be used. So I'm gonna start wrapping up. So Vincent's not angry. So I just want to say that of all the things that we discussed, right? Fertility, we don't know much yet. It may have an impact, maybe negative one. Mortality, it's likely to increase mortality, and migration, it would be the heterogeneous effect. So I think we still need to first consolidate the evidence, capture on the heterogeneity, and then later on use this kind of evidence and then see if we need to account for that or not in the population projection. So what I plan to do together with my colleagues in Vienna is to, because the way we build up scenarios in population projection is just the expert survey. So you guys would get it in the future. So sort of ask the population expert, what do you think would be the driver of fertility in the future? How fertility in Singapore would look like in the future, and would climate change affect it and all? So that's a kind of idea that I have. So I'm gonna finish right here. It's a hot topics, many hot topics to consider. I see you may have some students around here, and welcome to contact me and consult me, because I can see where the field is going, which thing is hot. I think one hot thing would be climate change and family and fertility behavior. That's for sure. If you work on this topic, good publication. And other stuff I just talk about the heterogeneity and pack mechanisms and so on. So I'm gonna just stop here.
Thank you, Prof. Raya. It's very rich, research and a lot of questions to think about. And it sounds like, you know, the situation may be different in different countries, as you have mentioned. And the challenge, I suppose, is to try to unpack the relationships in different domains and different contexts. So thank you very much for the talk. And can we have questions from anyone from the audience?
The chat is open to everyone now. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I think yeah, everyone can see, I think, yeah.
So I can put a slide now so we can see each other actually. Yeah.
Okay, Pook has a
Probably
question.
better. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Raya. I think it's very interesting, but at the same time, I'm also feel a little overwhelmed. Like, you know, it's so important, but I just don't know where to start, right? So, like for demographers, so we like to think like, okay, how about starting with thinking about what kind of data do we need to use to address these questions, right? So, and so maybe you can tell us like in your project, right? So it seems like, you know, there's so many things to address. It seems like you look at things from a global perspective, regional perspective, country perspective. How do you gather data, or if for students who want to study these topics, right? Or even researchers like myself, you know, are there, I mean, how do we link information? I mean, for example, we have access to, I mean, population surveys, right? But we don't have, I mean, how do we link information about climate change, rainfalls, or temperature? How does that work? Or is it are there already resources like that for people who are interested in the topic to study? Maybe you can guide us. I know it's a big topic, but maybe you can guide us where to start. I mean, if people are interested in these issues.
Yeah, I don't remember at all if I have. I think the paper that I sent around, I may have listed the data sources, particularly on the environmental side. I hope I did. If not,
You didn't get the paper.
yeah, I sent yesterday.
So really? Yeah, maybe
but I don't remember. So that's not a good thing. But the data. So yeah. So actually, in terms of environmental related, is what we are after would be the type of data that that has a geo reference. So it can come in the grid one or the subnational one, but in the environmental sites, particularly with temperature, rainfall. So there are many open sources that one could use. And what we typically do would be to match that data with our type of population survey data. So in the future, when you are going to collect data, please collect where the household is located, or at least the district. So that's already good enough, because what one wants is to capture the local environmental and climatic condition at the local level, as downscale as we can. So nowadays one could exploit a lot the DHS. So that's being used regularly for people interested to look at climate impact on nutrition, on child mortality, and so on. So that's kind of the idea that I want to do also with fertility. Now, you may say also that DHS only cover low and middle income countries. So we have what about 90 countries? What about the impact of climate change on countries like Europe or Singapore? Yeah, that's something I'm still trying to crack it. So one idea that I have for the project is to at least capture a bit of the sentiments. What do young people think? So sort of looking at Twitter. There are some Twitter accounts actually that the bird strike, for instance, that really are the hashtag that focus really on not having children because of climate change. So I thought of maybe trying to following these and then do some content analysis and see, I don't know. Yeah, so that's a kind of the idea, but
you
and
mean
there's some
that with like using big data and link it with geo data.
Yeah, because with the we can always one good thing of this geo data is we have it I mean, not I didn't produce it obviously, but it is available from 1900 pretty much. So you can always, even though you have cross-sectional data, imagine that you have run a survey and then you know about fertility pattern just one time, but I can always match it with historical climate data. So even cross-sectional data, it's already good because I could say in the past 1 year ago, 2-3 years ago, and doing lag, it's always a good idea actually. The lag climate, maybe a person has experienced floods, 5 times floods and drought and so on, and see how these affect their demographic behavior. So that's yeah. So if you happen to have the survey,
Talk more
which
about that. Yeah.
yeah.
I have a specific question here from Wei Wen.
Yeah.
And the question is, I think, quite a specific one. Is there a particular data set that you use for the migration research?
So different one, but I think this one, so if you know, I type it down as well, so you can search for it. Some of you may know, because this is the from the University of Minnesota, that they collect census microdata. Since it's a census, of course, you have limited variables in the census, but some countries do ask, where do you live 5 years ago? Some countries ask 10 years ago. So we can tell the location of the previous place of residence. We know where do they live now, and then by this we can establish internal migration. That's the idea. And for international, one work that I used the UNHCR data that look at the asylum seeking, because UNHCR collect the data on the refugees, right? And so it's a bilateral, so we know where do they come from and where do they go. So we could also capture this type of migration. Then there are many people also who use a household survey, a longitudinal household survey, capture where people move to. And I think that's also important work, because that you go down to individual level. All sort of work is important. Can be different level and scales, because we need more evidence pretty much. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions from anyone? I do have a question though, if I could ask.
Yes, we do have time.
Yeah, my question is, in a sense, how do you know that it's climate change that produces all of these changes in fertility and mortality and so on? So let me cite an example. We live in a time of climate change at a global scale. But in some sense, we also do live in a time of, say, economic upheaval, with precipitated by COVID and so on. Is there a way to isolate and to say, that these outcomes are due to climate change and not confounded with something like economic crisis?
Yeah, so we tend to over control, but yes, we do that. Particularly my colleagues. We have time fixed effect, regional fixed effects. We control for whatever local condition that we have. If we use individual data, also individual level of data. So yeah, of course, ideally also controlling for economic conditions and different driver, and then see if we still observe that net effects, right? So you can do it in different way, like the type of mediation type of analysis. You see the total effects. We add education level in the village and see if that's mediated or not. And I think, yeah, so not all the time, not all the variables, but they tend to stay, like the work that I was just showing on the voting, climate concern and voting. So it's already the subnational in Europe, so fixed effects. So we already account for that unobserved characteristics, but we also look at GDP in that area. And yeah, one thing that I could say quite consistent in all sort of outcome that we have looked at and people have looked at is the hot temperature. So irregular increase in temperatures on the hotter side tend to produce some kind of effects after adding all of this control. Rainfall would give you more sort of not stable results, but somehow with heat, and people link it with conflict, even both interpersonal conflict, like violence at home, domestic violence, but
That's
also conflict. Yeah, in general, yeah.
I mean, in a sense, if a typhoon passes town, the catastrophe that it creates is obvious, and the impact on economy would be would be palpable. But I suppose it'd be interesting to try to say, okay, a 1 degree or 2 degree increase in temperature, because a lot of there are two kinds of climate change, a drastic climate change and a more incremental climate change.
Yeah.
I would be curious to know what are the impacts of incremental climate change on things like economic performance and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right in that sense. So yeah, well, ideally we should try to measure also the cumulative effect. Like one of the paper that I was showing in the slides, it's not as long term, but they did measure mortality sort of 1 day before and compare to 1 to 60 days before and see if the effect is there's still long lasting effect or not. So this type of sort of lagging is important to capture, because it can be long lasting with the work that we did for internal migration, even though it's migrated experience of climate events or cumulative climatic events 10 years ago, we still see some pattern on migration. And then one interesting thing, I think that interesting to point out, the psychologists know before us, but we kind of copy that model. It's about the psychological distance, right? So and the recency of the effects, because if it's recent, we may remember it, and then we may change our behavior. So at least in this voting for Green Party's pattern, we really pick the effect of that 1 year-ish. The longer the time goes by, we still see the effect, but it's reduced. Yeah, it can be going that direction. But in terms of economics, I think it's different again, right? Because it can be cumulative. Like if you experience drought 3 times and you cannot even recover from the first one, yeah, you probably becoming more vulnerable. Yeah, so I think it's interesting in all directions to work on this topic. Yeah.
Well, we have 2 minutes left, and any last questions from anyone in the audience?
Maybe no. So
I wonder what's next in your project. I mean, it's just started, right? So do you have any particular plan to address issues or these relationships that you're talking about in the context of Asia?
Yeah, so for fertility, that one thing that I want to start real soon because it's I think we need to know more, and for the moment, yeah, for Asian countries that is in the DHS would be covered, but would be happy to know if you happen to know or would like to collaborate, obviously on the also countries like Singapore, Thailand that are not in the DHS for instance. Yeah.
Actually, Puk, that's one of the areas the center is looking forward to study more, the impact of climate change on family and so on. Yeah.
So we'll talk to you more.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. And I also because I'm not an expert on fertility at all, so I'm really happy to collaborate. And I would, now I just started, so I would recruit some postdoc and so on. So I think would be good. I could use some of these resources also for collaboration. So please come back to me.
Okay.
Thank you.
Shall we call it a day?
Yes.
Yeah, it's evening here on a Friday in Singapore, though I know that in Italy the day has just started. Thank you for spending the time with us to share with us your research, and really hope to keep in touch and collaborate in the future. So thank you, and shall we show our appreciation for Prof. Raya?
Thanks so much, and really looking forward. And obviously maybe most of you know I come from Thailand, so I haven't been back since COVID.
Wow.
So I try to go soon, and then maybe we can either meet in Thailand or maybe I can come over.
Oh yes, you said in Singapore.
Yeah, I never been there. So strange.
The more reasons to do so.